What do Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, ghost hunters, abolitionists, and feminists have in common?
I'm going to love this. I can already tell.
They all emerged from the spiritual capital of the United States, upstate New York, in the 19th century. I'm Peter McGuire, and this is my unlikely explanation. Thanks for joining me again, Jess.
So happy to be back.
This is your third podcast appearance.
Am I the most frequent guest is my question.
Yeah.
I'm going to be pissed if not.
It's pretty much you and Professor Michael Barkin have been the only guests. So.
We're the best.
We're the best. Yeah, thanks for joining. You are again playing your role as audience surrogate. You're going to ask questions and poke fun, and
I'm here to make fun, to poke holes, ask questions I know you won't have answers to.
I'm going to know everything this
time. And insert random cultural moments that are not relevant to what we're talking about at all.
Yes, that's a really key thing. No, that makes the audience feel at home. Because I've been working on this one now for about 5 months. This is the longest research period for any of the podcasts that I've done so far. It was something that I knew I wanted to do from the beginning of the podcast. I knew it was going to be a big thing. Mm-hmm. And last year I was really trying to get one podcast out a month or so. And I decided this year I was just really going to dive into this. And now we're going to make a fantastically long podcast about all of these strange occurrences in upstate New York. But I think that it's valuable to do because since all of these things emerged around the same time in the same place, you can make comparisons amongst them much more directly than you can with a lot of historical ideas. I mean, these people oftentimes knew each other, and so we can make more direct comparisons amongst all of these like totally different and outlandish ideas that people had at the time.
I'm very excited.
And I just went out to New York. It just so happened this all lined up. My girlfriend, Caitlin, her parents are from Albany. And I was just about to finish writing the script on this whole thing. And so it all just lined up that I got to go out to Albany, meet her parents for the first time, and then drive around and see a bunch of the locations that we're going to talk about in this. And in some cases, actually walk around the buildings that we're going to be talking about.
Excellent. How did meeting the parents go? Give me the tea first. It was important first topic.
It was great. It was really nice meeting them. They're so different from my parents.
Oh, I'm imagining like a cute old farmhouse that smells like dill and coffee.
It was a very cute little, they're in a little suburb of Albany called Del Mar, and it's this really old neighborhood, I think built like around the turn of the century, and their house is this like really old, like 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, but 3 stories of house. And one of their relatives was a painter, Anthony Tony, and they have all these oil paintings that this guy made. He was like a mid-century painter, so like every wall is covered in these old oil paintings.
That sounds so cool.
Which is wild. I've only ever owned prints, so it was a totally different world for me.
I'm imagining them trying to get to know you and you just staring at different paintings instead.
I did a lot to break the ice. I did a lot of reading from this podcast, actually, because they were they were interested in their region, and for me, words are sometimes easier when you write them ahead of time.
So you had a lot of fun facts to share?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They got absolutely peppered with fun facts. But yeah, it was great because I got to check out some of these places, so I'm able to add to the script that I've written here. In the audio version, you'll get a little more of my little stories and recollections, things I noticed as I traveled around.
Can't wait. I hope that there are photos.
There are. Yes. Yeah, I will. If you only listen on audio, there is always a blog post associated with each of these, and that will have links to resources, and then I'll also include a bunch of the photos that I took, because I was able to take a bunch of photos.
Listeners, that's going to sound like it was planned. It was not.
Yeah. Thank you for the plug. All right. In 1863, 2 years into the Civil War, the abolitionist and feminist Frances Dana Barker Gage published her account of a speech she'd heard many years earlier, given by the black woman abolitionist Sojourner Truth. This speech stoked sympathy for Southern slaves and support for the brutal and inconclusive ongoing war that they were in. Ain't I a Woman became an instant classic of abolition literature, and many of us read it in high school when learning about the Civil War.
And that was the title of the speech?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ain't I a Woman. It discusses intersectionality, which has become a major focus of feminist discourse today. Truth uses the contradiction between her race and her sex to challenge how she's treated by white society. Frances Gage presents this speech in what she called Truth's original dialect. And I'm going to read it as Gage wrote it for reasons that will become clear in a moment.
I can imagine.
Dat man ober dere say dat woman needs to be helped into carriages and lifted ober ditches and have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. This is how it was written. I found no record of how Truth responded to this publication, but we can assume it was with at least some surprise and annoyance. She prided herself on her English because English was not her first language. Until she was 9, Truth spoke Jersey Dutch, a Dutch dialect spoken by Dutch American settlers. She very likely spoke the black variant of the dialect, which is called Negerdouts, Black Dutch. She was born into slavery in 1797 in New York on a Dutch American farm. The family sold her at auction at age 9 to an English-speaking New York family, along with a flock of sheep for $100.
Oh my God.
Yeah. She gained her freedom at age 29 when New York freed all of the remaining slaves in the state in 1826. At which point, she joined up with end times preachers, Mormons, and eventually abolitionists. This period of her life we will return to later in the podcast. But for now, let's focus on the fact that in 1851, Sojourner Truth gave her famous speech, and she lived in New York her whole life, and all of it north of the Mason-Dixon line. In that year, an account of her speech was published in the Anti-Slavery Bugle, which sounds much closer to how Truth spoke. So this is likely what Truth actually said.
Okay.
I want to say a few words on this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. Can any man do any more than that?
Wow.
Yeah.
What?
Comparing this version to the version published by Gage 12 years later, in 1863, it becomes painfully clear that Gage rewrote the speech into a Southern Black dialect and radically altered the text of the speech. It appears that Gage either worked from the transcription of the speech and she altered it as she worked, or she remembered Sojourner Truth as a sassy Southern woman.
Had they known each other as individuals?
They would have crossed paths in the abolition world, and she went to the speech, and she was at this speech.
Okay.
But then 12 years later, when she wrote it in this really over the top Southern dialect.
She has a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah. Gage appropriated Truth's identity and credibility to publish a rousing speech, mostly that she had written, whole cloth. New York in the early to mid-19th century spawned many of the movements that shaped the contours of American life. Sojourner Truth was one of many Americans for whom direct, intense, and often eccentric spiritual experience went hand in hand with radical visions of social justice. Her words and even her identity were appropriated far beyond her control or her intention. In this case, at least the appropriation matched her intention. Many of the figures we will meet as ghosts here in the next few pages weren't given that courtesy. In this episode, we'll explore the conditions and legacy of a place and time where radical ideas of feminism, atheism, and abolition intertwined with ideas of direct revelation, prehistoric North American Jews, and ghosts. So many ghosts.
The Venn diagram of this episode and my interest is a circle. I just want to be clear.
From Quakers landing in America to Dorothy landing in Oz, let's explore how the American imagination has been shaped by the burned over district of upstate New York. The quest for perfection. New England's intellectual life was shaped by religious toleration. This means that religious groups were free to practice Christianity as they saw fit without being actively persecuted by the state. Tolerance did not mean that religious groups in New England tolerated each other. In fact, most of these communities unified political and spiritual rule. They were small theocracies, and therefore most communities were distinctly intolerant of the communities around them.
And this was just forms of Christianity.
Yeah.
That's it.
And forms of Protestant Christianity.
Okay. Still down to hate each other, though.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah, any small difference is enough. Massachusetts expelled so many people from their ranks that Rhode Island became necessary. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second.
Okay.
To understand the religious climate of 19th century New York, we need to go back a bit to 16th century England. In 1527, the devoutly Catholic Henry VIII petitioned the Pope for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of newly unified Spain. Mm-hmm. The Pope, under the control of the Spanish monarchy, declined, setting in motion a process that culminated with Henry declaring himself as the ultimate head of the church in England. Just 10 years earlier, a massive challenge to the authority of Catholicism erupted in Germany with the ministry of Martin Luther. This new Christian sect seized on centuries of criticism against both the Church and the Pope in Rome and set off widespread religious revolt against Catholic authorities. This movement is broadly known as Protestantism. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Henry aligned himself with Protestantism, but he believed strongly in Catholicism. In fact, at that time, he was the defender of the faith. He had been given this title by the Pope. And he attempted to contain the Reformation just to the secular realm. He just wanted to replace the Pope at the top with himself, and really not much else.
He just wanted to have whatever bitch he wanted.
Yeah, that was the main thing. He sacked and looted monasteries, executed powerful clergy, and made himself the head of the church. In uniting church and state, Henry invited centuries of religious persecution and counter-persecution as the crown passed from Catholic to Protestant and from radical to moderate. A major English Protestant faction came to be known as Puritan because they sought to purify the church of its Catholic influence and tried to make it more in line with Protestant ideals.
Oh, I didn't realize that it was based on purifying, like Catholic influence.
Yeah, that the church had been degraded by all of these years of Catholicism, and now they needed to purify it and make it a cleaner, more historical, ancient kind of church.
They're just like chucking out the incense, getting rid of the jewels.
Yeah. Keep it very focused.
Keeping the robes one color, toning it way down.
Yes.
That's what I'm imagining.
Yep.
Okay.
They also believed that virtually all activity done for its own enjoyment was sinful.
Good.
Yep. They believed their souls could be purified by living in meticulously holy ways, and believed that all people must live in similar ways for the world to be appropriately pure, and therefore prepared for Christ's return.
They sound like a fun group of people.
They were great. They focused on outlawing all recreational activities outside of attending church, praying, and reading gospel to bring about this perfect worldly state. Sinful activities included drinking, using tobacco, playing games, making music, and most of all, dancing. Dancing was the thing they were always railing about.
I mean, dancing and the devil go hand in hand. We all know that.
Everybody knows that. And the Puritans really honed in on that.
That's a list of all my favorite activities. Yeah. These people are bummers.
You like recreational activities?
It turns out, as a human, I do.
Wow. A little over a century later, the ruling order experienced a massive upheaval when the long-ignored Parliament took the extraordinary step of executing the man who was both head of state and head of the church, Charles I. Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, assumed political control via a military dictatorship, declaring himself the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. This dictatorship only outlived Cromwell by a year, as Parliament rapidly lost faith in his son, Richard Cromwell, and offered the throne to Charles's son, Charles. The remaining parliamentarians who had signed the execution warrant for Charles I were rounded up and themselves executed. This included the extraordinary step of exhuming Oliver Cromwell's body and parading it through London, hacking his head off, and displaying it on a pike for many years.
That's tasteful.
Yeah. The remaining Puritans fled for their lives.
I could see why.
Immigration to Puritan colonies in America all but stopped during the decade of the Commonwealth, but now the floodgates opened, and expelled Puritans came across the ocean en masse. They tried to create an idealized Puritan England in this land that had no established nobility. This proposed nation would consist of Northern European Protestants with strictly enforced codes of behavior held by the entire community. They attempted to unite society with their Protestant ideals, and now recent experience has convinced them that monarchy posed a grave threat to their vision of society and therefore the salvation of everyone. Mm-hmm. Only a republic could allow them the kind of control over their fate, both on Earth and in the hereafter, that they desired.
I am feeling pretty proud of myself right now for knowing the majority of that little history rundown.
Yeah.
But I think I have to admit that it's because of my addiction to historical films and BBC specials. So not classy reasons, people.
I was going to say, I think a lot of this we learned from the other Boleyn girl.
That's definitely one of the major players in me understanding the political machinations that he just ran through. No shame.
No shame. Okay, Quakers and outcasts. Even in the New World, Puritans couldn't maintain their orthodoxy. From 1636 to 8, a crisis erupted in the Massachusetts Bay Colony when Anne Hutchinson accused the leading ministers of preaching a doctrine of salvation of works rather than salvation through grace alone. This is an early example of the process that gives American Christianity the particular beliefs that it holds.
And was it based on the fact that works, I assume she meant text, right? Is it still that Catholic thing of does the gospel come directly from God or does it come from a priest reading a text?
It's very related to that issue.
Okay.
The main thing that she was arguing was that the priests were too focused on living in Puritan ways and being Puritan type people. Mm-hmm. Works being like the things you choose to do throughout your life.
I see. Okay.
Versus grace being something that God just gives you.
Interesting. She just wanted to dance.
Yeah. So there was like this tension between like more mainstream Protestant beliefs is broadly where the Puritans come from, where it's like we need to live in this certain way to be holy.
Yeah.
And then there's also this Calvinist belief of predestination, which is that from the moment of your birth, you're either going to heaven or hell, and you don't know about it yet, but it's already been decided.
We're just skipping right past original sin?
Yeah. Doesn't matter. As long as you get baptized. I mean, you still have to get baptized, but as long as you get baptized, heaven or hell, God knows everything all of time. So he would know whether you're saved or not from the moment of your birth.
Whether or not you're a good person or not. Is that sort of the basis?
Yeah. And there's only a very small number of people who do go to heaven.
See, that is a slippery slope, though, because...
So most of us are doomed to hell from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so there's this tension in these early Puritan communities between this belief that they hold and also this like way of life that they want to uphold, which is living in these holy ways. Why do you live in these holy ways if you're either damned or not damned from the moment of your birth? And
if God knows all, so there's no amount of non-dancing you can do to change his mind about who you are as a person.
Yeah. So most Puritans believed that only God can save or condemn a soul and can't be swayed by human actions. Okay. Humans are too lowly and too simple to ever change the mind of God by living in a certain way.
I mean, it does sort of seem like this opens the door to doing fun recreational activities, though. So
it does kind of seem like that, doesn't it? Anne Hutchinson, following the teachings of John Cotton, felt that Puritans were placing too much emphasis on the community's behavior and not enough on personal experience. This challenge to the ministers was eventually decided in court, both secular and ecclesiastical. Anne Hutchinson defended her accusations in court and doubled down on the importance of personal experience when, on the second day, she claimed that God had directly instructed her to challenge the clergy. The idea of direct revelation was way too much for John Winthrop and his allies to allow, and Hutchinson was banished.
Wait, we have to go back, though, because she had brought this issue to court based on her being prosecuted for doing something, or she, like, sued the authorities?
So she had been going around saying John Winthrop and the current leaders are not really holy because they are focusing on the wrong thing.
Yeah. Instead, they should be focusing on grace.
Yeah. And in a world that's essentially a theocracy, this is essentially blasphemy. Okay. She's saying what we know from God isn't true, essentially. And so I think she was brought up on blasphemy charges. And then while she's supposed to be defending, hey, no, I'm actually an Orthodox Puritan, she says, and by the way, God told me I need to challenge you about this.
Yeah, so listen up. Wow.
Which is quite a ratcheting up of the
ladies,
the
this is what
position you've
happens
taken.
when you besmirch holy men.
Yeah. Yeah. So she got banished to she and her followers made a deal with the nearby town of Providence to colonize the island adjacent to it, which was Rhode Island. Providence and Rhode Island received threats of invasion from Boston and from Plymouth for the next few decades until they were able to get their own charter from the British Crown, because they were just an outlaw colony for a long time.
And she had followers.
Yeah, there was a group within this. There had been a previous preacher, John Cotton, who had kind of laid this groundwork of this sect that Anne Hutchinson was a part of. And so there were other people within this kind of like way of seeing things.
I prefer to give Anne all the credit here. I'm just going to erase
yeah,
the
that's
John
fine.
Cotton note.
So Hutchinson was pushed out of Rhode Island and started a new settlement in the Dutch territory of New Netherland. Mm-hmm. Her settlement was massacred by the local American Indians and escalating tensions with the Dutch settlements that were nearby, and she died in a forest north of New Amsterdam, a place that's now called the Bronx.
I have to... she died in a forest. That she died by battle wound?
I'm not sure. Either that or starvation or exposure or something. Her town was destroyed and she was kind of cast off into the woods.
The term she died in a forest, I just had to know more details.
A forest called the Bronx, Jess. You're focusing on the wrong part of it.
I'm already derailing the podcast, guys.
New England in the 18th century saw increasing immigration from other persecuted English groups. Prominent among them were the Quakers. In England, Republican rule had left behind a fear of religious extremism. And the response was a new orthodoxy of intolerance. So while in America's, it was basically, we won't mess with you. In England, you needed to toe the Church of England line now because they were afraid of Puritans or another extreme group coming in.
Shit had gone down. They weren't going to tolerate it anymore.
Yeah, there you go. Anglicanism recentered itself around a mostly Catholic theology, and some Protestant influences snuck in, and laws were passed to ensure that political figures towed this Orthodox Anglican line. These acts included excluding Irish Catholics from governing Ireland in any way. It pushed all Catholics out of power.
That turned out really well for them.
Yeah, ongoing. Well, we'll see. Yeah. Ongoing.
TBD.
Creating an early English experiment in dispossessing native land and using a legal system to take land out from under people who already lived in a place.
In England?
In Ireland.
In Ireland, okay.
Yeah, so this new way of enforcing Anglicanism also allowed them to dispossess Catholic power, basically, and slowly English came to own all of the land of Ireland, and the people who lived there, the Irish, became tenants of English landlords over time.
Yeah.
Although not as restrictive as Puritan behavior codes, Quaker religion made it very difficult for adherents to participate in civil society. Formerly known as the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers didn't have any particular theology. They were united in the belief that every person, regardless of personal belief, can access godly light within themselves. Quakers made for difficult citizens in the 18th century because they refused to participate in war. They couldn't swear oaths, so they couldn't be sworn into courts or hold office. So that kept them on the outside of power by choice, essentially.
I mean, can you really be critical of a Quaker, though?
I know, right? Like, as I read about Quakers, I was like, I feel like I'm kind of a Quaker as far as that goes.
I'm very skeptical of organized religion in general, but every time I hear about any kind of Quaker belief, I'm like, okay. Yeah.
Seems to pretty much be okay.
That checks out.
Yeah. A prominent Quaker, William Penn, found himself regularly held in contempt of court because he refused to remove his hat. Quakers didn't believe that any man should be above another, so he wouldn't remove his hat when he went to court. He was constantly being put in jail for contempt. Quakers believe that rank and class have no meaning to God, so no man should ever be subservient to another.
Which, of course, is true. That's just true.
I mean, Jesus was pretty clear on a lot of this stuff.
Oh, God.
I felt. When I was a Catholic and I read these things, I was like, seems like Jesus is pretty straightforward about some of these issues.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think there was a pretty famous line about the likelihood of a rich man getting into heaven.
Yeah, right.
It seems to be pretty glossed over around this time period.
Exactly. Yeah. Quakers place great emphasis on having these personal experiences with God. The name comes from how the soul is affected by experiencing God. Your soul quakes. They rejected...
I did not know that. Really?
Yeah.
Oh... This is going to be the episode where I become a Quaker. I can feel it.
I can feel it. Well, just wait till you hear about the Shakers, because they might be your kind of Quaker.
Yes.
They rejected religious clothing, symbols, and rituals as man-made. Typical Quaker gatherings involve silent, private prayer and testimony where anyone with a personal experience of God can stand up and declare it to the group. And
men and women, right?
Yeah,
I think that this was like really game-changing at the time.
Yeah.
That women could also... testify, or whatever their version of that is.
Yeah.
Like hold personal experience that was just as valid.
Yeah, exactly. Women were pretty much treated equally by Quakers.
Let's all be Quakers.
Yeah. They're lovely people. And they were also pretty unique in that pretty much every group had programmatic church meetings, as in you go through a program of steps, you do this and this and then this. Mm-hmm. Quakers were one of the only groups that just got together in a meeting house and had a meeting where they either prayed silently or discussed religious experience.
Sounds so much nicer.
It does.
Hang.
Yeah. After growing up Catholic, it does sound really nice.
Yeah.
Since given that like 80% of a Catholic mass is the same every time.
And they wonder why you're bored out of your mind.
Yeah.
And I would imagine the lack of sit, kneel, stand is refreshing.
Yeah, but that's what keeps you awake.
Oh, yes.
It's when you're doing the God hokey pokey.
The God hokey pokey.
Keeps you engaged. Quakers refer to each other as friends.
I am familiar with that. And their schools are called Friends, yeah?
I think Society of Friends type things.
Yeah. I always associate a school called Friends as a Quaker school.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're everywhere.
Yes.
By the way.
That makes sense.
William Penn was the son of a prominent naval administrator, and he lived in Cork, Ireland in his 20s, and he began attending Quaker meetings. Before long, he was testifying to his visions of God in public squares, and consequently was brought up on charges of breaking the religious gathering laws. You can't just have a spontaneous religious service out in the open air under these Anglican laws. You have to have an Anglican priest do it in an Anglican church.
Okay.
So that was the law that he broke.
Great.
Yeah. He refused to abide by the court procedures and found himself in jail for contempt, and was unable to face charges without acknowledging the superiority of the court. After one of these run-ins with the law became a national scandal, Penn's father, William Penn Sr., felt the need to disinherit his son. One of Penn Jr.'s trials became a landmark in jurisprudence when he convinced a jury that while he'd broken the law, he had done no wrong. And they returned a not guilty verdict. The judge said that because he had obviously broken the law, he would not accept a not guilty verdict, and imprisoned the jury. The imprisoned jury demanded a warrant of habeas corpus, and a higher court ruled that judges cannot hold juries in contempt for making verdicts. And this is a rule that became a cornerstone of the American legal system.
What is the point of a jury if they return a decision that they can be thrown in jail for? That's outrageous. Yeah. I've never heard of this before.
So one of these Penn trials, and like I said, it's become a cornerstone of American jurisprudence that if it's a jury trial, the jury can't be overruled. The jury is the final say in a jury trial.
It actually blows my mind that anything else was ever the case.
Yeah.
What was the point?
But even in other countries, I don't know a ton about French and Spanish legal systems, but I know in a lot of cases it's a panel of 3 judges that determine these things rather than juries. Juries are more of like a Germanic and then English kind of concept. So there's certainly court systems that don't rely on juries that way. And
I mean, this is not what this podcast is about, but there's certainly holes you could poke in the jury system for sure.
I would say so.
Yeah. So
my buddy the other day said, what a system. A lawyer figures out their case and then gets a group of 12 randos to look it over. And that the idea of a jury of your peers being randomly selected is hilarious to me. Anyways. I don't know how much I want to leave my fate in the hands of 12 people who don't know anything about the law as opposed to a judge. Right. And I think like 3, there's 1 crazy, there's 2 to balance them out. So does seem, Good work. Yeah. You're open to it. That's good. On his deathbed, the elder William Penn pulled strings to get his son out of jail so he could see him one last time. Impressed by his son's steadfast devotion to his beliefs, the elder Penn publicly re-inherited his son on his deathbed. So when his father died, Penn Jr. found himself in possession of an enormous loan to the British government. Oh. After much finagling, a deal was struck where Penn was granted a large parcel of land in North America in exchange for forgiving the debt, and if he would remove as many troublesome Quakers to the Americas as he could.
And take all your friends with you.
Exactly. Yeah. English settlers had already given this parcel of land a name, which was Sylvania. It's a Latin term meaning woodland or forest. We also see it in the term Transylvania, the other side of the forest. Penn and the Quakers laid down initial buildings and roads of Philadelphia, named for a Greek city and meaning a place of brotherly love. The new city was to have wide boulevards filled with green spaces that would help citizens feel at one with God's creation. I'm talking about Philadelphia. A charter of liberties guaranteed that trial by jury, freedom of religion, and freedom from unjust punishment and free elections would be granted to all Pennsylvanians.
Okay. Why do you think they chose a Greek name? Isn't that kind of out of nowhere?
There's a lot of classical references. And as we go across our tour of New York, a lot of places were just named. Keep in mind, this is the Enlightenment. And a lot of the people naming things are just in love with Greek and Latin kind of ideas.
That checks out.
Yeah. The Constitution of Pennsylvania also required that all dealings with American Indians be as fair as any deals between Christians. This was a utopian project designed by a radical dreamer, and it foreshadows the utopian experiments that we'll see throughout the 19th century. Mm-hmm. Penn returned to England to secure a proper charter for his colony. Much to his chagrin, the colony was named Pennsylvania to honor his father. Penn was embarrassed and feared that people would think that he had named the colony after himself.
We have to stop here. How did his own colony end up accidentally named something other than he wanted? Was this like a horrible mistake accident at the courthouse?
Well, no, he came. Everybody knew the place as Sylvania, and that's what he wanted it to be called.
Yeah,
but a
super cool name,
in
my opinion.
But the British government wanted to honor his father because the land had been granted to pay off this loan to his father, and his father was this great man that they all adored. Ugh. So they tacked Penn.
Such an English thing to do.
So they tacked Penn on the front of Sylvania.
They're like, we know what you want as the person who is
and the people who live there and people settling this place, but we have a better idea.
Let's tack a man's name on the front.
Government officials would not budge. Pennsylvania became the center for Quaker emigration, and it shares a long border with the upstate New York region that we'll be focusing on. Mm-hmm. Many Quakers, before the states were exactly hammered out their locations, this is the region that we're talking about.
Okay.
God's country.
There are a lot of Texans that would take umbrage with that comment.
Initial English and French visitors to North America comment on how densely populated it was. When they first arrived.
Okay.
French fur traders comment on the campfires they saw filling up the forests of Canada. Jamestown suffered such bad health in part because the settlement was downstream from all the human waste of Chesapeake Bay. Virtually every spot in Chesapeake Bay had already been occupied. Yeah, basically all the water came from wells dug into a landfill, a human waste landfill. Early colonists often faced stiff resistance from existing American Indian polities, and then things started to change. Colonists found greater and greater success dispossessing American Indians by force. They moved into unpopulated regions overflowing with food. They moved into forests stocked with game and berries, streams so overflowing with fish you could pluck them out with your hands. Passenger pigeons in such great number that they would block out the sky. These are experiences that early colonists discuss.
That's actually kind of terrifying.
I know, right? The birds.
I don't know if I want that many pigeons.
Given their theology and world theories, English settlers interpreted this as God's blessing. It fit into their idea that wickedness and vice of European society had destroyed its God-given wilderness. They looked at the American forest and assumed that this was the true natural state of the world.
And just displaced an entire indigenous population in the process and destroyed it. Great. Keep going.
But in fact, none of it was natural. As we know now, landscapes that look like this mean that the prey population Whenever you get rid of coyotes in an area, suddenly the deer populations explode, that kind of thing. This was an ecosystem that was missing its apex predator. Many English claims to American land rested on the idea that land must be continuously improved. This idea continued from the founding of America well into the 20th century, as Americans were awarded large tracts of land for free in the West as long as they built on it and converted it either to farm or industrial land. Because American Indians lacked European-style farms and permanent structures, English courts often held they had forfeited the land by not improving it.
Even though that's not part of their deeply held religious beliefs, is that land cannot be owned. That is not a concept that existed before English settlers came.
Yeah.
Why? So I want to go back though. Why was there no apex predators? It was just like fur traders had so reduced, like wolves, coyotes, bears, that was the situation, or was there something else going on?
Yeah. I'll give you just 1 second.
Okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll be quiet now.
We now know that this abundance of food was made possible by millennia of careful work by American Indians. As with the Amazon rainforest, the forests of New England were shaped by forest gardening. Pre-Columbian Americans created these vast interconnected terraforming projects. They would cut down clearings through forests, they would plant seeds and commingle crops. All up and down rivers, American Indians planted crops together, not in orderly rows like Europeans, but in bundles. These bundles of crops deplete the soil more slowly, and when planted along rivers, this is a sustainable form of agriculture. Likewise, forests provided sustainable nutrients with roots, berries, and animals when managed properly. The city of Buffalo, New York is so called because bison roamed the forests of neighboring Ohio due to these large networks through the forest that the Native Americans had built.
That's incredible.
When neglected, this system quickly fell apart. Disease and invasion weakened and then eradicated American Indian populations in many places throughout the Americas. It's important to remember that these diseases didn't strike a single blow. Different diseases moved in pockets across a vast landscape. Smallpox epidemics were still ravaging American Indian populations in the 19th century, 3 centuries after first contact. In some communities, 9 in 10 people succumbed to disease. American Indian military strength rapidly diminished, and many settlements had to be abandoned entirely. The English took advantage of this new balance of power, and immigrants quickly occupied the conquered and abandoned lands. So essentially, so many humans had died off in North America that they were no longer keeping this whole population in check.
Wow.
These traumas left an impact on the American Indian psyche and their culture.
Yeah. Yes.
We now tell a lot of zombie stories. It's a big part of our pop culture today. American Indians watched entire communities die of disease and watched ravenous hordes of European peasants take their place. They watched the apocalypse happen.
Wow. I think this is especially like a prescient moment too, because it's been so there's been a recent movement to re-examine the like re-education schools of Indigenous American populations, and they've been digging up the grounds of those schools and discovering hundreds of bodies.
Yeah.
Like this is, I don't know, it's just the more you dig, the more utterly disgusting and horrifying it is.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out a lot of those were, at least initially, these Catholic missionary points.
Yes.
And when you look at missionary work, as a Christian, you go, oh, you're saving people, you're spreading the word of God. When you look at it from a historian's point of view, like, how can you call missionary work anything other than cultural warfare? You're sending cultural agents in to infiltrate other cultures and change them from the inside.
Not to mention that it is an organization dominated by sexual deprivation and mail order. So it's just a breeding ground for the abuse of children, which we now know is a huge, huge problem. It's disgusting.
Yeah, it's true. At the same time, Catholics and Protestants were launching massive campaigns of Christianization. American Indian communities were infiltrated by missionaries intent on replacing their Indian cultures with their own.
Yeah.
Sometimes they succeeded, but more frequently the pre-existing religion just incorporated some new Christian ideas into the existing structures. Many of these new hybrid religions took the form of apocalyptic cults, and it's not hard to see why. they were living in end times. The end times that Christianity had promised was happening in real time to these Native American communities.
Yeah, like this perspective is so obvious, but it's definitely never one that I've considered before, embarrassingly so. But of course, they were living through their end times, of course. Yeah. Literally.
They saw themselves dying as a people.
Yeah, that's not an exaggeration in any way. Yeah.
In the stories of rejuvenation and resurrection of Christ, American Indians imagined a reset button for the Americas. If Christ could bring justice to the world in an apocalypse, he could bring justice to the land and to the peoples of the Americas as well. By the 19th century, all that remained of many American Indian communities were their names. White Americans now occupied places with names like Manhattan, Oneida, Poughkeepsie, and Seneca. The American Indian communities that called these places home had been Christianized and integrated, moved west to reservations in places like Ohio and Wisconsin, or eradicated entirely. The Indians who remained were broadly termed Iroquois in this area that we're talking about, because that was the name of this powerful confederation that once bound all of these small tribes together. And so it becomes this like blanket term that we can use in the period of time that we're talking about.
Okay.
In 1799, a warrior and negotiator, whose name translates to shaking snow, became gravely ill while suffering deep depression and alcoholism. He dropped unconscious, and when he awoke, he was spiritually reborn. Like many prophets, he adopted a new name, which translates to Handsome Lake. In his vision, he met a man along a road and said he had come across the great waters and had been slain by his own people. He showed Handsome Lake his scarred hands and feet and said, "They slew me because of their independence and unbelief. So I have gone home to shut the doors of heaven, that they will not see me again until the earth passes away. Now let me ask you how your people receive your teachings." Handsome Lake responds, "It's my opinion that half of my people are inclined to believe me." The man on the road says, "You are more successful than I, for some believe in you, and none in me. Now, tell your people that they will become lost when they follow the ways of the white man." So in this story, we have Jesus Christ declaring that all white men are damned until the end times do come. Handsome Lake also received instruction from dead American luminaries such as George Washington that his people should return to their ancestral homes on the East Coast and retake their territory. These teachings made Handsome Lake a moral and political leader who brought newfound unity to the Iroquois. He preached against 4 cardinal sins, heavily influenced by Puritan Christianity. They were drinking alcohol, practicing witchcraft, using love charms, and performing abortion. And it's probably worth noting that 3 of these 4 are explicitly directed against women. Love charms, witchcraft, and abortion were all women, like cultural things.
Can we go back to shaking snow? That guy was probably chiller.
Yeah. But now we just have Handsome Lake. Shaking snow is no more. Handsome Lake prefigures many of the charismatic preachers of the burned over district in both the sense of purpose that he gave his followers and the eccentric ways that he used power. When challenged for growing despotism by the orator Red Jacket, Handsome Lake received a vision of Red Jacket burning in hell.
Wait, Red Jacket?
What? Was just another leader within the community who challenged him. And
for bringing puritanical belief, I would think that they were like, hey, this isn't
really our deal.
Yeah, what are you doing? Okay.
So he just saw him burning in hell. That's how he dealt with that challenge. When another epidemic hit in 1807, Handsome Lake divined that the cause was a great underground beast that needed to be unearthed. When the beast couldn't be found, witches were blamed, and women were persecuted. At least some women were burned to death.
When in doubt, blame witches.
Yeah. So we see a pretty strong Puritan influence on this reign.
Yeah, to really positive consequences, as we can see.
One of these executions became a murder investigation, and the independence of the Iroquois nation came into question. To protect their independence, the community banished Handsome Lake. After Handsome Lake's death, a new generation of prophets emerged in his tradition and formed the last bulwark resisting white colonization in upstate New York. By 1838, much diminished, the largest Seneca reservation was displaced in the interests of expanding the Erie Canal. The transaction is considered one of the greatest frauds in American Indian history. Prophet saw visions of hell for anyone supporting this resettlement to Kansas, but in the end, the communities were displaced. For New Yorkers, American Indians slipped into the romantic past, where they could be viewed as noble savages, such as in The Last of the Mohicans. In Cooperstown, New York, there remains a single marker to their memory. On a mound beside the highway, a plaque reads, "White man greeting. We near whose bones you stand were Iroquois. The wide land, which is now yours, was ours. Friendly hands have given back enough to us for a tomb."
Wow.
So this is the land that we're going to be discussing throughout this episode.
Okay.
It's important to remember there were people here.
Yeah. I thought at the beginning that maybe we were going to gloss over that, and I see that's not the case, and I'm very proud of you for that.
So to round out this first section of the podcast, I'm going to take you on a little tour of New York so we get a sense of the land, the geography that we're talking about.
Tour me.
Okay. This story is sculpted by geography, so here's the tour. New York City lies at the extreme south end of the state. Mm-hmm. Directly west from New York City is New Jersey, and then Pennsylvania. So our story takes place north of there, and north even of Boston. So Boston lies up the East Coast. Albany is actually north of where Boston is, so that we're higher up, kind of more in line with Vermont for most of the story.
Gotcha.
For most of history, it was faster to travel by over water. Mm-hmm. And to ship cargo over water than over land. And consequently, the significant economic development of upstate New York follows the waterway, both natural and man-made. Mm-hmm. So to access this upstate region, we travel north up the Hudson River. Upstate is a nebulous term. For this podcast, I mostly use this one book, Upstate Cauldron, by Jocelyn Godwin.
That's a really good name.
Yeah. And in Upstate Cauldron, he defines upstate as beginning where the magnetism of New York City no longer affects the mental compass.
Oh, I love that.
So that's the definition.
Really easy to pinpoint, I would think.
Yeah. For our purposes, it's Poughkeepsie. So as we go through Poughkeepsie, we meet Andrew Jackson Davis, the Poughkeepsie seer, who became a leading medium and channeler of spirits starting in the 1840s. Continuing north on the Hudson, we reach Albany. Originally a Dutch fort and trading post, it's one of the oldest settlements in the United States. Albany is where the disappointed converts of William Miller met when the end times failed to occur, and they created Adventism there. Ooh. Albany was a major commercial hub. North of this point, the Hudson begins to narrow and becomes difficult to navigate. From Albany, ships can access the New York Harbor, the East Coast, the Atlantic, and the rest of the world from there. Mm-hmm. As a result, this was the terminus for the Erie Canal and for most of the early railroads. Okay.
I feel like I should come clean and say that I have never been to upstate New York. New York City, yes. New Jersey, yes. Upstate New York, no. I'm very new to this.
Yeah, I think it's okay. I think for most people, New York is New York City.
Which is
which lives in a totally different universe than the New York that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
I went to a wedding in Schenectady. That's my extent prior to this trip. I'm surprisingly industrial for a wedding.
But your family's from New York, so it's interesting that you didn't go more.
Yeah, my dad's family grew up mostly on Long Island, and my dad was actually born in New Jersey secretly. Oh. So they were more in the orbit of New York City than this upstate region.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Starting in 1817, New York State embarked on a massive project of linking the waterways from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. The Erie Canal allowed New York social movements to expand rapidly because now people could travel across the state twice as fast in many cases. It's estimated that the canal cut shipping costs to upstate New York by 90%, creating an economic boom and inviting a huge amount of immigration.
Wow.
This created a thriving marketplace for new ideas and an ample supply of potential converts who were unmoored from their historical cultures and religions. All of these people who had moved here.
From?
Around the world, mostly Europe.
Okay.
A lot from Germany and England.
Okay.
As we travel west by canal boat, we come to Utica, which was a major site for evangelicalism.
I think it's evangelism and evangelicals. Yeah, maybe?
Major site for that, abolition, and spiritualism. The Erie Canal, by providing access to the Great Lakes, became the last leg on the Underground Railroad, a network by which Northern Allies smuggled enslaved people to Canada. In quick succession, we then hit Rome, Oneida, where an intentional and particularly strange utopian community lived, and Syracuse, where L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, grew up towards the end of this time period. We're now due south of Lake Ontario. From here, you can reach the lake by natural waterway and connect to Rochester and Toronto. However, to reach the other Great Lakes, we're going to continue. You would need to travel up the 167 feet of sheer cliff that is Niagara Falls. Okay.
I have a mental picture. I'm worse at geography than I thought I was. Is what I've taken away from this.
It may help to look at a map. Continuing west, we pass by Seneca, which was a Shaker settlement, and then an intentional community of true inspiration. And we pass by Seneca Falls, which was the site of the first Women's Rights Convention and the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
I am very excited to get to the Shaker section.
Yes. Shakers are great. We pass by Palmyra, where Joseph Smith first spoke directly to God. We then hit Rochester, the home of the Fox sisters and the epicenter of ghost communication.
I did not realize that Joseph Smith was a New Yorker.
Yes. Vermonter by birth, New Yorker by upbringing.
Interesting.
So you'll hear lots about his childhood.
Okay.
That's kind of what I focused on in his section.
I should have known. You mentioned the Mormons were going to come up.
Yeah. Rochester is also the home of Susan B. Anthony, and she could not have cared less about ghosts.
You don't know that to a certainty.
She said she didn't care. Rochester also became a center of the American Theosophical Society, the first Universalist church, and in the 1960s, it became an epicenter of New Age. The final stretch of canal gets us to Buffalo, on the American and the Lake Erie side of the Niagara Falls. Home to the revivalist apocalyptic American Indian movements of Handsome Lake. From here, ships can travel the Great Lakes and reach Cleveland and Detroit, and then Green Bay, Milwaukee, Chicago, and then eventually Duluth. Okay. So from here, we open up the whole Midwest.
Got it.
At the time of the Revolution in 1776, much of upstate was sparsely populated forest that was slowly returning to its natural state after disease had wiped out so many of the upstate people.
Yeah.
The various nations of the Iroquois Confederacy had fought on both sides of colonial disputes between England and France throughout the 18th century. Wow. They kind of teamed up with whoever was most advantageous for them at the moment.
I gotcha.
And this whole region was hotly contested. The French claimed everything west of the Mississippi, basically. And so anywhere that was borderland was... Most of the people who were living there were American Indians. So they were the people who were tapped into for these parts of the battles.
Yeah.
In the American Revolution, 4 of 6 of the nations sided with their long-standing allies, who were the British Crown, against the rebels, the Americans. After various skirmishes and guerrilla warfare, including the massacre of an American settlement by Iroquois and British troops, Washington sent his generals John Sullivan and James Clinton to destroy as many Iroquois settlements as possible. This action eventually led to the dissolution of the Iroquois Confederacy. Even so, American founders such as Franklin and Jefferson championed the American Indian Confederacy as the ideal model for a federal government.
Wow.
Even as they eradicated this way of life.
Yeah, of course.
Much of the conquered Iroquois land was given to American soldiers as payment for service or was sold to speculators and pioneers, often with the caveat that they remove any remaining American Indians who happened to be on the land that
was
they
their
just bought.
actual charge?
And they needed to build a mill were the two things they needed to do to take possession of this land.
Here's some land, get murdering was the order?
Or push them off somehow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, it was usually like, we've designated these people a reservation, so anyone who's still living there shouldn't be there.
Is disobeying the law, they themselves don't acknowledge as law, so
you're going to need to be our agent of making sure this happens, if you want to live there.
Right. Citizen justice, I see, is in our blood.
Yeah. Right. Federal surveyors divided the land into a regular grid of townships with names given for classical cities and the heroes of Rome and of England. So we get lots of cities named Hector, Scipio, Cincinnatus, Locke, and Dryden, for example.
I kind of dig Cincinnatus over Cincinnati.
Cincinnatius is pretty good.
Cincinnati, if you're listening, maybe reconsider.
Yeah, so they're named for a Roman general, Cincinnatus. The first major cash crop of upstate New York was the forests themselves. In this age of early mechanization, water powered the world. New York was a land of lakes, rivers, and most importantly, waterfalls. Sawmills and grist mills sprang up in townships across the state, slowly transforming this landscape into a European-style farmland. The outpouring of natural resources made the transportation networks described earlier possible and even more lucrative. General James Clinton's son, DeWitt, inherited his land in the military tract and became a governor who championed the Erie Canal. Detractors of the Erie Canal called it Clinton's Ditch.
Burn.
In understanding how easily people could traverse New York, it's worth also noting that oftentimes it could be quicker in winter because of this abundance of frozen water. In winter, the same sled that can carry you over the snowy road can also carry you across the rivers. So this is the land that we're going to talk about. Easily traversable, economically booming, lots of immigration, and it provides a breeding ground for strange ideas and for spontaneous communities and followings.
Okay, let's get into it.
All right.